Hello, my name is Rahul Chandran. I'm with the Center for Policy Research at UN University, and I'm honored to be joined tonight by Comfort Iro, who's the director of the Africa program at the International Crisis Group. And she's giving a talk at United Nations University tonight on competing solutions to keeping peace in Africa. But we thought we would take this opportunity to have a little conversation and share some of those thoughts with those of you who cannot join us this evening. So Comfort, thank you very much for coming all the way here. It's a privilege to have you.
Thank you.
I wondered if we could start by talking about the problem that you see in Africa. So competing solutions to keeping the peace in Africa. What is the challenge? What is the peace that we're trying to keep, and what's causing instability across Africa?
I mean, it's hard to generalize. We always say the context matters, but I think that we can make some basic generalizations that the trajectory or the causes really haven't changed fundamentally. At the heart of it is still the problem about the state, about the governance of that state throughout the country, its ability to exercise any legitimacy beyond the capital, that some of them do not have the responsibility, some of them do not have the ability to push themselves beyond the capital to provide any real legitimacy. Another issue is the contest between various groupings seeking accommodation at the center. The state itself becomes the source of contestation because of the lack of means or access to resources. Many see gaining access to the state or winning the state as fundamental to guaranteeing their own future. For some, it's a matter of survival. For others, it's also about being marginalized. A lot of minority communities feel that the state doesn't accommodate their interest. And then at the most basic, it's also about personal ambition, about political control. And it's also, and we tend to call this good governance, but when you break it down, it does come down to some of these very simple issues. And then there are more complicated issues about communal tensions and about how various communities have tried to grapple with their own existence in country as well. So some basic generalizations about conflict right across the continent.
We've talked about solutions to keeping peace in Africa. Do you think it's actually fair to describe Africa as a single unit, as a continent, in terms of the typology of conflicts that we're seeing? Or do you see the conflict in, for example, Mali as being very different from the conflict we see in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, or in Somalia?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think the problem is because there's a tendency to see, well, not so much see Africa as a unit, but there's a tendency, yes, you know, some say Africa is a country, some forget that there are key interests, key problems driving at the heart of these countries. And I think that the challenge for external actors intervening on the continent is that they tend to assume the same kind of solutions for a number of countries. So you'll see peace agreements, resolutions by the United Nations, solutions to these conflicts tend to have the same ingredients, to assume that you can transport one idea that worked in X country and assume that it can work for another country. And that's not to appreciate the complexities. We talk a lot about the root causes, but even understanding the root causes itself is a challenge. And you'll find that the very first task has often to be better grasping, understanding the undercurrents, very deep, interlapping, overlapping undercurrents. For Mali example, the assumption very much was that this was triggered from the outside, but when you take away the Libya effect, then you begin to realize that there were deep complications, parent, patron, client, fault lines between the north and the south, the politics vis-a-vis the north and south, the history of the Tuaregs communities in northern Mali, successive peace agreements that have failed, why they failed, and how we're grappling with resolving the conflict to ensure that we don't repeat the same mistakes of the past.
People have talked about the center-periphery divide, the distinction or the difference between those who have access to power in some of these countries that are experiencing conflict and those that are excluded. Do you think that these states in question, Mali, DRC, Somalia, but also some of the others that have conflicts from further back in time, Liberia and Sierra Leone, do you think they will be able to become strong enough to address all of those political needs and desires for expression?
I mean, we always say, or we always remain optimistic that, you know, states will overcome the core reasoning as to why they went to conflict. And I mean, if you look right across the board, I mean, Sierra Leone and Liberia have overcome, you know, decades of conflict, political crisis and war. And to a certain extent, they're seen as success stories. But then you've got the more challenging scenario of DRC, which since its inception, since independence, has never been able to find the ingredients that will bring stability for long enough, whether it's in relation to the particular dynamics in relation to Eastern Congo, whether it's around Kinshasa's own politics, the way in which governance has often been managed in the country, the way in which the government itself has tried to extend and find that it has no real capacity beyond the state to govern the country. And other issues around conflict, land, resources, access to issues have often been at the heart of the Congo. And in a sense, Congo is many countries. You know, it has the border relations with Rwanda, with Angola, with Zimbabwe, different economies, different politics, different groupings that never really relate to the center. And in fact, most of the times you'll see in a lot of these societies that the center is very much divorced from the rest of the state's life. And that many people have abdicated from the state and become entities of their own self and no longer relate to what you call Kinshasa or to Bamako or to any of the other states.
But that raises a very challenging question. You described Congo in a way as multiple different countries. We see in the Middle Eastern conflicts a lot of analysts start to ask the question, are the borders that we see sustainable? Is that also a question we need to be asking about some of the conflicts we see in Africa? Are the current border configurations that we see sustainable? Are these in fact countries that can continue as countries, or do you anticipate fragmentation?
I mean, it's interesting that right across the continent, the only region where we've seen real secessionist tendencies, except for Nigeria and Biafra civil war, is in the Horn of Africa, and where you've seen the borders redrawn. So Ethiopia and Eritrea, and the most recent one is Sudan, South Sudan. So it's very specific to the Horn of Africa. There have been murmurings of other groupings wanting to secede or create autonomy. The Malians, for example, is the most contemporary. And then you've heard murmurings, for example, in the Central African Republic, where the Seleka and the way in which the conflict there has unfolded, you've seen a de facto splitting of the country, and you've seen both militia groups, the Anti-Balaka and the Seleka, claiming territorial control. But when it comes down to it, I mean, yes, we've been talking about the borders for a very long time. The African Union and its predecessor, the AOU, themselves pushed against any change in the borders, and they were very resistant up until the very end in terms of changing the border in relation to Sudan, South Sudan. So it's come up time and time again, but it's very particular to the Horn of Africa that you've seen this very clear change of borders.
But there's maybe another narrative about the border areas that is also interesting, and it's part of this conversation that we're seeing. Africa rising is, I think, the term that's most widely used. And there's been a lot of news recently about discoveries of oil, of gas, quite often concentrated in border regions where there is already contestation and conflict. How does that narrative of Africa rising play out in the next decade or two, and how does it particularly matter in these border zones, in these contested regions?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, today you've got two contradictory narratives, that the Africa rising and then the Africa still at war and conflict and everything. What is interesting is that a number of these new explorations that we're seeing are in countries that are unstable or are coming out of years of war. So, for example, Ivory Coast, as you know, issues of oil exploration there, Sierra Leone, fishing and oil, same with Liberia. The most critical, I think, is in relation to the DRC, where it's found new oil minerals deposits. The same in relation to on the Kenya-Somali border, Kenya's own discovery of oil. Kenya itself being very resilient despite upheavals and political crisis, has managed to still remain resilient to the kind of conflicts that we've seen in the neighbouring countries like DRC or Somalia. At the same time, you've seen a situation where a lot of the resources that we've seen in a number of these countries are on contentious borders. So we go back to your issue of borders. It's also in key periphery communities that have often been distant from the centre, from the government. And now today, the central government has to think about its relationship to those peripheries, because if they want to generate growth, if they want to become sustainable, they need to now navigate those relationships with the peripheries, and then you see another kind of contestation. It's very much true in Kenya, very much true also for Ethiopia, and it's very much true also for the DRC as well.
There's a number of storylines that could come out of these discoveries, and one of them is obviously overwhelmingly positive. A central government that has access to significant resources chooses to invest in its relationship with these excluded people and extend the authority of the state out. There's also an alternative that's perhaps less welcome. Which of those two do you see as more likely, or do you see something else as more likely to happen? But how and where will the answers emerge? Who is going to help these local communities, even cities and provinces on the periphery, to re-establish their relationship with the centre? What's the role of the international community in that?
I mean, Kenya's got an interesting experiment going on now after the constitutional change and devolution came in. And that's all about local government, autonomy to these local entities who wanted self-government, but within the structure of the state as well, where the state still remains centre. I mean, I think the role of the international community will be around governance, around how you manage the resources to guarantee that the redistribution of wealth is also felt in the communities that have these various deposits. I mean, Nigeria is a classic example in this case, where for so long the struggle has always been around the redistribution of the oil wealth and making sure that the communities where the oil is found, even though it's by accident of birth that you happen to be located in these resource areas, that wealth comes back to those communities. I mean, we started the conversation about the kind of conflicts that we see on the continent. One of the generalizations we can make is that sometimes conflict has been over the distribution of wealth and making sure that the resources come back home. Home not just to the state at the centre, but home as in the peripheries. And getting that right and making sure that governments know how to better manage the revenue to make sure that it stays at home, it benefits local communities, remains a big challenge going forward, especially for a country like Kenya and then for the DRC and all these other countries that are discovering minerals or resources, the management of those resources, ensuring that the revenue is properly generated to ensure basic deliveries, which a number of states still can't manage, do not have the capacity to ensure proper implementation of governance at home, would be key to the future of managing conflict.
That's a more subtle and long-term form of assistance, and in a sense, what we see mostly being discussed is peacekeeping, and I suppose it makes me ask, is peacekeeping still an appropriate and useful instrument for the international community and for the Africans that it's supposed to be helping, or do we need to change the way we approach this?
Well, it's interesting. I think peacekeeping has evolved dramatically from what we understood it in the Cold War, and even from how it's begun to play out in the post-Cold War period, so that today peacekeeping missions now have an economic governance aspect to them. So Liberia was probably the very first one where you had this governance and economic management aspect brought into the resolution for the UN mission, and where the UN itself played a key role in helping, working with donors and Liberia to think about how to manage its resources. You also see it today in the Central African Republic, where there's a lot of conversation around how to help the government think about protecting its resources. And you're seeing conversations taking place in Guinea-Bissau, in Somalia, about how to ensure that revenue generated, for example, from the port of Kismayo comes back and is used wisely in the country. So Peacekeeping, yes, it's not just about security. Security being key as an enabling environment to make sure that the climate is conducive. But peacekeeping can't remain in that static form that we traditionally known it, and it has had to take on many faces. The question is whether we overload it too much so that it can't get the basics right, which is about security, which is about protecting civilians, which is about making sure that the human rights abuses are checked as well. Getting those fundamentals right, I think, would be important. But ensuring that if we all agree that one of the root causes of conflict is around competition and tension around resources, getting that right in the mix of resolutions becomes quite important as well.
One of the phrases we've heard a lot in the discussion on the evolution of peacekeeping, particularly on the African continent, is African solutions for African problems. Do you think that's a useful solution? Do you think that the African continent is the right actor for all problems, or is a more nuanced approach useful?
I mean, it's not so much that is it the right solution? I mean, there is a history behind the narrative of African solutions, and it's born out of the end of the Cold War, born out of decolonization, the desire that Africa first and Africa working together to build consensus and solidarity against neocolonization. So there is that history that informs it, but over time I think it's become a convenient mantra for those who don't want to put their boots on the ground. It's become a convenient label also for Africans who want to take ownership rightfully of their problems as well. But I think it's become a label for different enterprises. The African Union, for example, in seeking to become more assertive, has become a lot more mature and wants to take ownership of conflicts on the continent. Yet, not everybody on the continent, not all the regions, not all the member states wants the African Union to play that role. So they have a different notion of what the solution should look like. The international community, not wanting to put boots on the ground, particularly the P5 members, hide behind African solutions and push the regional approach. But even in the region has a different view and divergent views as how to pursue African solutions as well.
So do you think a greater international troop contribution would actually be welcomed and useful on the continent?
And even that is also open for debate, because at one level you have those on the continent who want to go it alone and demand, what they want is the financial assistance. So give us the money and let's get on with it. But then the UN itself has become very reluctant, particularly at the Secretariat level and even at the Security Council level, wants more oversight, that if we are paying for this, therefore we need more oversight as to how we go forward. At the end of the day, to go back to your question, there is no right actor. There is no actor that has the capability financially, militarily, politically to go it alone. I think they're all important actors. The UN provides a certain role. The African Union, the region, also provides a certain role. I think getting the balance right in terms of the international division of labour and being honest about what each actor can do, cannot do, when each actor is relevant, I think is where we should shift the debate to.
You've talked about the need for the UN to play a role in economic governance and that it is starting to think about this role, but also concerned about overloading peacekeeping missions. What else does the UN need to do more of?
Well, getting the basic rights. I mean, getting the fundamentals right. We talk about protection of civilians. That becomes the heart of the matter when you look at the crisis in South Sudan, for example. Being able to react quickly and appropriately within the mandate that you have, making sure that your troop contributing countries are actually, working with the mission and not relying or turning to their capitals as well. I mean, just the basic fundamentals of your mandate, of dealing with the fact that civilians who are vulnerable and very much reliant on the presence of 17,000 or 20,000 troops need to know that security can be guaranteed by United Nations. And when we look in a number of countries, South Sudan being the most explicit, Central Africa being another one, we find that on occasion the UN is found wanting in terms of moving quickly, slow mobilization, in terms of focusing on the fundamentals of providing security. We have a situation, for example, today where in South Sudan, the UN found itself outgunned, outmanned, unable to deal with the fallout and the crisis that happened in December the 15th. And yet it was a mission that supposedly had a lot of international support, but regional support. And yet we couldn't get it right there. And you have a situation in Central Africa where next week we are going to rehat the mission, 12,000 or so troops, and yet we haven't overcome some of the basic issues that have challenged peacekeeping for quite some time.
You've raised the question of South Sudan, where the political settlement to some degree collapsed. Do you think we're doing enough to support political settlements and revisit political settlements that are under pressure? It is difficult to build and secure a sustainable peace after a conflict. Are we bringing adequate resources and attention to the political side of the matter?
I mean, I think one of the big challenges now is making sure that we maintain a very high degree of political engagement. I mean, in a sense, the cynic suggests that the reason why we have these peacekeeping operations, you know, we push responsibility to the UN, leave the UN to run it alone. They really are not, in the grand scheme of things, of major national interest or preoccupation to the permanent five. So we give them a peacekeeping mandate and we let the UN take responsibility of it. And then there's no deep, sustained political engagement. And I think what we're finding, or what we may find in Central African Republic, is that the attention is shifting. The opportunity was there to mount the peacekeeping mission. Whether that will be sustained after September, after the rehatting in September, is questionable. Okay. You know, and so long as nobody raises the G word, so long as nobody says that you've got these atrocities going on right across the country, then it will be allowed to bumble along. You know, and I think why we have these difficulties is that you don't have a sustained political engagement. For a lot of the mandates and a lot of the peace agreements that are signed, nobody is working alongside those countries to make sure that they remain sustained.
We are in Tokyo this evening, and as you know, there's been an active debate in Japan about Japan's role internationally, and Japan expanding its role, particularly in peacekeeping. If you were in a position to make suggestions or prescriptions to Japan about what it could do to help the cause of peace in Africa, what would you ask?
I mean, it's a good question. I think, I mean, let's at least credit Japan today, its role that it's playing in South Sudan, a very good one in which it has provided engineers to provide a proper protection for the UN. I think we need more engineers. I think if Japan wants to claim a global role for itself, then it needs to step up in terms of peacekeeping. We understand its constitutional constraints, and there's an interesting debate going on right now as to Japan's role internationally. But I think also that Japan rightfully needs to recognize that if it wants a seat at the table, that its economic weight is not enough, that it needs to show its footprints on the ground in a meaningful way that suggests that it's going to play a role. Having said that, I mean, Japan, you know, does contribute significantly to a number of important agencies, humanitarian agencies and economic agencies that are playing crucial roles in Somalia. So constitutionally, it can't put its defense force in Somalia, but it supplements that by contributing significantly to the various agencies that are doing a lot of work. And in South Sudan, it's taken an innovative role of placing some boots on the ground, but it probably needs to step up a little bit more because the situation in South Sudan is critical and they need more peacekeepers outside of Juba and into other places.
Last question for you. If I were to give you a crystal ball and say, what are the problems that you see over the next 2 years, and what does the international community need to be worrying about that it is not worrying about?
I mean, I think one of the things I would say is that not everything that we see is new, and there's a tendency to turn around and say, oh, the developments on the continent are new. So let me just say that first. But there are certain things that one needs to pay attention to. I think, well, today we're calling it radicalization or Islamic extremist evolving everywhere. I would couch the language very carefully and understand why, particularly on the borders of these countries, particularly in the north, that we're seeing, you know, the revival of old grievances that we saw in the 70s, 80s and 90s, and questions have to be asked about the relationship between those borders and the centre as well. We've seen also Africa is seen as the last frontier, the Africa Rising issue, and again on the borders where a number of the periphery communities are, it's also home to a number of resources as well. Yeah. And so you may see a mixture of center-periphery but border tensions, and so that good neighbourliness policy of the African Union and member states may be up for contest as well. But I don't imagine, I mean, the other new conflict, and I would caveat and question how new it is the transnational threats, particularly in West Africa, the Gulf of Guinea. But the reason why I wouldn't say it's necessarily new is because it's a spillover of the lack of governance at home onto the high seas. And the fact that a number of these countries haven't got an economic governance right at home is now having an effect on the high seas of someone like the Gulf of Guinea. We saw how it played out in the Gulf of Aden in relation to Somalia.
Dr. Comfort Iro, thank you very much for your time here today. We've really enjoyed having you. It's a privilege, and we look forward to your talk this evening. Arigato gozaimasu.
Thank you.